thank you all very much for coming on the gallery as well. I think actually they might have the best view. My name is Daniel Freed. As Alex said, I'm in the last year of my doctorate in English. I am certainly not a medievalist. I'm also not a scholar of the Persian, Turkic, Chagatai, Islamic world. I do the reception of this stuff. But I am here today to talk about one of the most exciting episodes in the history of early modern history of scholarship in the West, which is the discovery in the West of the first time of the star tables of Ulugh Beg. For those of you who have been to the Registan, the central historic square of Samarkand, there is a very large building on the left, the Ulugh Beg Madrasa, that is standing there now as it was standing in what we call the 15th century. In it, there are some very large pictures of Ulugh Beg, as there are indeed throughout Uzbekistan, because he is, for modern-day Uzbekistan, a national hero of post-Soviet independence. He's also a hero of the history of astronomy, for reasons that will hopefully become clear during this talk. Ulugh Beg was the grandson of Tamerlane, but to sort of every extent less of a warmonger and more of a scholar. And his main love was astronomy, and he patronized some of the great astronomers of the day. Which makes it all the more remarkable that next to all of the pictures and all of the statues of Ulugh Beg in the Ulugh Beg Museum, there is a drawing, an engraving rather, of someone who is known to maybe only a dozen people in the world, some of whom who are in this room, the curators of the Savile Library, and the others of whom are those interested in the byways of early modern intellectual history. Because next to Ulugh Beg, the great astronomer-ruler, there is a picture of a 17th century Oxford scholar called John Greaves. John Greaves was the second civilian professor of astronomy. He succeeded John Bainbridge, who was the first incumbent of the chair, and they were together the first people to bring Ulugh Beg to the West. The reason I'm talking to you today is because together with Maddie Slavin and Nika Kontovas, I'm thinking about some ways in which to present this exciting episode to the public in some form of an exhibition, because it is a really exciting story for two sort of similar but actually very different reasons. The first is that it is a very cool, exciting, international story about Oxford scholars going across borders, doing very exciting things with manuscripts, sort of discovering major episodes in the history of science, and in many ways is a corrective to the standard narrative that the West got there first, and that the history of science is something that should be told about isolated geniuses in their room. But on the other hand, this is a very local, very Oxford story about the persistence of philology and some pretty nerdy stuff in the age of the new science. So, this is where everything begins, MS Savile 46. This is a very workmanlike copy from the 15th century of Ulugh Beg's star tables. It was probably made for use in an observatory because it is not a prestige object by any means. And it was bequeathed, as we know from Wilpool's History of the Savile Library, to the Bodleian at Bainbridge's death. Bainbridge learned Persian to understand this work. We know he learned Persian because his notebooks where he tries to teach himself Persian are in Trinity College, Dublin, and Bainbridge, like me, seems to struggle with learning Persian. I fully identify with all of his difficulties. Anyway, he realizes it's important. He teaches himself Persian, one of the first in Oxford to do it, rather than just Arabic. It is a very Arabized Persian, by the way, and a lot of these things are place names that are carried over from the Persian to the Arabic, so there are some similarities. But he does this for three reasons. The first is astronomical. Ulugh Beg provides a comprehensive and stunningly accurate series of tables about the position of the fixed stars. The second is philological, because like all early modernists, Bainbridge knew that if you added a new language, in this case Persian, to your Greek, your Latin, your Hebrew, you could start to build up a better understanding of the history of languages, in this case about the history of star names. And the third reason is chronological, because although Bainbridge's his work remains in manuscript and unpublished, most of his exciting stuff was done for the purposes of reconciling ancient chronologies, dates, calendars, and so on, and Ulugh Beg gave him more data about the history of celestial phenomena. Now, Bainbridge dies, and his work is continued by John Greaves, the person from the museum, one of the most unusually adventurous Oxford dons of the 17th century, who actually climbs into the Great Pyramids in Egypt. This is his copy, this is his notebook that he made when he was traveling in the Levant, Turkey, and Levant, Turkey, and Italy. You can see where he's copied out the hieroglyphs. It looks as if he's sort of been bending the notebook on his knee in the dark, copying out the hieroglyphs. He also makes some sort of pretty sniffy remarks that the Vatican Library is always closed. I think he had been spoilt a bit by the Bodleian. So Greaves goes for sort of one main reason, or two main reasons. The first is to buy new manuscripts. This was the age of Laud, when people will go, Archbishop Laud, when people were going out of Oxford to sort of try and bring back sort of exciting new scholarship from the East. But the second real reason, and you'll see here in this manuscript where he talks about taking measurements with an astrolabe. That astrolabe, by the way, is just on the left of the entrance to the Museum of the History of Science across the road. It was made originally for Elizabeth I. But he goes to Rhodes, to Constantinople, mainly to work in and Alexandria, to work in imitation of some ancient astronomers, Ptolemy, Hipparchus, and Geminus, because he can better figure out the latitudes from which they took their observations. That's one of the reasons, but as I said, the second reason was to go and gather up new Eastern scholarship. And you'll see from this book over here, one of the most exciting things that Greaves realizes when he's in Constantinople is when he brings with him the star tables of Tycho. He shows them to some local astronomers in Constantinople and some local merchants, and they tell him two things. The first is, closer to their home, there was a guy called Ulugh Beg who built the world's largest sextant. Indeed, it is 40 meters across in radius. It still survives today. You can go see it. And the second thing is they compare their tables and they figure out that Ulugh Beg in the 15th century was just as accurate as Tycho was in the 16th. This is a dramatic moment of sort of Western scholars at the peak of astronomy realizing that actually some others had got there first when it came to observation. Now, Greaves publishes some of these tables, but he also, and this is a book I'll come back to right at the end, starts to take from Ulugh Beg a series of measurements, not just about the celestial sphere, but about the terrestrial one. But he realizes because of this astronomical importance, he's got to come back to Oxford. He starts working on Bainbridge's manuscripts, and the result is this small book, one of my favorites of the 17th century, Canicularia of 1648, the first half of which is Bainbridge's work on chronology, in which he corrects the arch chronologer, Scaliger, a feat that is actually recorded on Bainbridge's tombstone. This is a very exciting thing to do with correcting the ancient Egyptian Sothic period, upon which Bainbridge and to some extent Greaves relied quite heavily on Ulugh Beg's positions of the dog star, which was known as Sirius. The second half of this is very exciting for bibliographers because it includes the first ever printing in Oxford in Arabic type. This was the types that Laud brought back for the University Press, and this is in the, I can show you actually, if I move over here. This is the first time Arabic is, oh, sorry, I'm very short, so it's hard to reach over. First time Arabic is printed in Oxford, albeit for Persian, but they could do it without too many changes to the type because it, as I said, was a very Arabized Persian that they were using. So, at this point, Greaves dies, and you'll see a pattern of people sort of not quite finishing their work, and it takes about 15 years for Thomas Hyde, not an astronomer, but a philologist, Bodleian librarian, and a future Laudian professor of Arabic, to publish in full the star table portion, not the entire manuscript, just the star table portion of Ulugh Beg's work. Now, this is a very interesting copy, and we can leaf through it and I'll show you in a second. But this is the copy that Hyde used. He pasted in lots of slips of corrections and so on. There was eventually, he tried to use it for a revised second edition, but that actually only came to fruition in the 18th century, which this was used as the copy text. Now, this brings me to my final part of the talk and my conclusion, which is that Hyde was no astronomer. Although Seth Ward, who was another civilian professor of astronomy, because there was lots of continuity between their projects, had sort of commissioned this work, he did that mainly because he owed Greaves a lot personally. He owed Greaves personally for getting him the job. The Royal Society, which had been founded sort of in around 1660, 1662, did discuss funding this book, but they thought first Hyde asked for too much money, second that there were likely to be printing errors in the Persian, and third that this was sort of more of a prestige publication that they were going to use to sort of spread the usefulness of the Oxford Press and spread the usefulness of the Royal Society, and they never went ahead and funded a full edition of the actual manuscript, which includes 3 other introductory chapters on astronomy. So this is an interesting episode in the split between philology and astronomy. I started off by saying that this was interesting to the civilian professors because it included astronomy, philology, and chronology, and to some extent that astronomical luster had started to be replaced by what is a divergence in the skills between the best of the philologists, the Arabists in 17th century Oxford, and the interests of the astronomers. You'll see one of the most interesting examples of that is in here. This is a book that was owned by Henry Jacob of Merton College, one of the most sort of eccentric and lovable figures of 17th century Oxford. He taught John Selden Hebrew and Arabic, and his books were dispersed when the parliamentary visitors ejected him from his fellowship in 1648. This is therefore a remarkable survivor, one that Thomas Tanner writes to Edward Llwyd, the linguist and natural historian, to say, oh my gosh, have you seen these annotations? The annotations are purely philological. You have Henry Jacob working in the margins in his Greek, his Hebrew, his Persian, his Arabic, working on philology and chronology. So, although this did start to lose some of its astronomical sheen, it did start to gain a fourth discipline that we can add to the list as the subjects begin to diverge, and this is geography. Because whilst Ulugh Beg's tables were mainly renowned amongst astronomers for what they could tell you about the positions of the fixed stars, part of his other work, along with that of Abu Fida, famously, was geographical. For most early moderns, they knew the region, what we now think of as Central Asia, pretty vaguely and inaccurately as Tartary, especially the region beyond the Oxus River, which is the river that Alexander the Great famously crossed at what is now modern-day Termez, a rather volatile border town between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. But they had no idea what was there. And you'll start to see in here, for example, as well as in Greaves' manuscript over here, that he had actually started to map out places that they had no idea their names or even whether or not they existed. So, in conclusion, what started out as a celestial story with everyone's head towards the stars and the skies ends up being a pretty terrestrial story about what you can discover about the unknown world, about the history of Islamic civilizations, about the history of Islamic astronomy, and of the places previously unknown which produced it all. Thank you very much.